Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine, even when you're alone? Tonight, that feeling might have a story to tell. Hello, I'm the Mesmer. No matter where you are, or what time it is, I'm here to guide you into a realm where shadows whisper and mysteries unfold. Leave your worries behind. Let your mind wander and drift into the unknown. Here, where shadows dance and secrets lie in wait, allow your thoughts to drift into a dream of mystery. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and relax. If you enjoy this, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts. Let's begin. Ethan Carter adjusted his camera lens, peering through the viewfinder at the rolling hills bathed in late afternoon light. The countryside was a patchwork of gold and green, dotted with crumbling stone walls and clusters of ancient oaks. It was the kind of landscape that drew him out of his urban cocoon time and again, chasing the perfect shot, the perfect moment. He checked his phone's GPS. No signal. Typical, he thought, out here in the middle of nowhere. The rental car's navigation system was equally useless, a spinning wheel of confusion. He had a map, an old paper one, crumpled and faded from years of being stuffed into the glove compartment. Silver Creek, it read, marking a small town that seemed like the perfect spot to rest before continuing his journey to the coast. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows stretched long over the road. Ethan frowned, feeling the prickling unease of being caught out too late. The narrow road twisted through dense woods, the branches forming a tangled canopy overhead. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour. Finally, as dusk settled in, Ethan spotted the sign. Welcome to Silver Creek, in peeling white paint. The town itself appeared almost out of nowhere. A cluster of old brick buildings, quaint and picturesque, like something out of a forgotten postcard. There were no streetlights, just the soft glow from a few shop windows, and a peculiar stillness hung in the air. He parked the car by a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. Betty's Diner. Inside, a handful of patrons turned to look at him as he entered, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The bell above the door tinkled, a strangely cheerful sound in the otherwise silent room. Ethan slid onto a stool at the counter, offering a polite nod to the elderly waitress who approached. Her name tag read, Marge, and her smile seemed stretched too tight, like it hadn't been used in a while. Passing through, she asked, pouring him a coffee without waiting for his order. Yeah, trying to make it to the coast, Ethan replied, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Thought I'd stop here for the night. Marge nodded slowly, her eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. It read 6:02, but the second hand was stuck, twitching in place. Best to be inside after dark, she said quietly, especially for strangers. Ethan's brow furrowed. Why's that? Old town, she shrugged, as if that explained everything. Folks here like to keep to themselves at night. Ethan took a sip of the coffee, its bitter warmth settling his nerves a bit. Any place you'd recommend to stay? Only place is the Silver Creek Inn, just down the road, Marge said, glancing at the others who were now studiously avoiding eye contact. They'll have a room. Thanks, Ethan replied, finishing his coffee. He left a bill on the counter, noticing how Marge's fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up. Outside, the air had grown chill, and the quiet pressed in around him, unnervingly complete. As he drove slowly down the main street, he noted how the houses were all dark, curtains drawn tight, not a single porch light glowing. The Silver Creek Inn loomed at the end of the road, its Victorian architecture looming in the growing darkness. A single window on the second floor was lit, a pale yellow glow that did little to dispel the shadows. Ethan parked, grabbed his bag, and headed up the stone steps, each one slick with moss and age. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and a small bell chimed. The lobby was empty except for a man behind the counter, his eyes sharp and alert despite his age. "Room for the night?" Ethan asked. The man nodded, sliding a tarnished brass key across the counter. "Room 3. Breakfast at 7, check out by 10. Ethan took the key, feeling its surprising coldness. "Thanks. Quiet town you've got here." The man's lips twitched, almost a smile. "We like it that way." Ethan climbed the stairs, the wood groaning beneath his weight. The hallway was dim, the wallpaper peeling in places, revealing layers of old patterns beneath. Room 3 was at the end of the hall. Inside, the room was simple. Bed, nightstand, an antique dresser, and a single window overlooking the empty street. He set his bag down, pulled out his camera, and reviewed the shots he'd taken earlier. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. He undressed, the chill of the room sinking into his skin, and slid into bed, pulling the thin blankets up to his chin. As he closed his eyes, he thought he heard something, faint, like a whisper, carried on the draft that seeped through the window frame. But when he opened his eyes again, there was only darkness and silence. Ethan awoke with a start. For a few moments, he wasn't sure what had jolted him from sleep. The room was cold, the kind of damp chill that seeped into your bones. He turned over, glancing at the bedside clock. 3:17 a.m. Something felt off. The silence was too deep, too absolute. No wind, no distant hum of crickets, nothing. The kind of silence that made his ears ring. He held his breath, listening, heart thudding against his ribs. Then he heard it. A soft shuffle, like feet dragging against old wooden floors. It came from the hallway, just outside his door. Ethan sat up slowly, pulse pounding. The sound moved, soft, deliberate steps passing his door, pausing just outside for a beat too long. Then, silence again. His eyes flickered to the door. The light from the hallway seeped through the crack beneath it, casting a faint glow onto the worn carpet. For a second, he swore he saw the light shift, like something, or someone, was standing just beyond his line of sight. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. He exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the unease. Old building, creaky floors, just your imagination. Still, sleep wouldn't return. By dawn, the feeling had settled into a dull paranoia, a lingering unease in his gut. The next morning, Ethan headed downstairs, feeling the stiffness in his limbs from a restless night. The lobby was empty except for the man at the counter, who regarded him with an unreadable expression. "Sleep well?" the man asked. Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, fine." The man nodded, as if expecting that answer. Outside, Silver Creek felt even stranger in daylight. The streets were empty. Not deserted exactly, just still. The buildings stood like hollowed-out shells, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The few people he did see moved in quiet, measured steps, heads down, eyes never lingering too long. Something about it gnawed at him. Ethan grabbed his camera from the car and began wandering, snapping pictures of the eerie, picturesque emptiness. He had traveled through plenty of quiet towns before, but Silver Creek was different. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt watched. As he lifted his camera to photograph the general store, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. A woman stood in the window of an upstairs apartment across the street. She was pale, her long, dark hair draped over her shoulders, eyes locked onto him. The way she stared, unblinking, expressionless, sent a chill down his spine. He lowered the camera for just a second. When he looked back, she was gone. His fingers tightened around the camera. He wasn't imagining this. Something was wrong here. A voice startled him. "You shouldn't take pictures." Ethan turned. An old man sat on a bench nearby, wrapped in a thick coat despite the morning warmth. His eyes were cloudy with age, but sharp with warning. "Why not?" Ethan asked carefully. The old man sighed, rubbing his hands together. "People don't like strangers poking around." Ethan frowned. "I'm just passing through." The man shook his head. "Don't stay past dark." Before Ethan could respond, the man rose, shuffling away down the street. Ethan watched him go, a growing sense of dread settling over him. He needed answers. That afternoon, he found himself back at Betty's diner, where Marge, the waitress, was cleaning the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. She looked up as he entered, her face carefully neutral. "Back again?" Ethan nodded. "Coffee." She poured him a cup without a word. He hesitated, then decided to push his luck. What's the deal with this town? Marge's movements slowed slightly, but she didn't look up. "What do you mean?" "It's different," Ethan said. "People don't talk much. Nobody's out at night. And there was a woman this morning watching me from a window. I blinked, and she was gone." Marge finally met his gaze, something wary in her eyes. "You saw her?" Ethan's stomach tightened. "Who is she?" Marge set the coffee pot down. "You should leave before nightfall." "That's the second time I've heard that," Ethan said. "Why?" Marge pressed her lips together, as if debating whether to say more. Then finally, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "This town, it's not like other places," she said. "There are rules. We keep our doors locked. We don't go outside after dark. And we don't talk about..." She stopped suddenly, glancing over Ethan's shoulder. He turned just as the bell above the door chimed. A man had entered, tall, gaunt, with deep-set eyes that locked onto Marge. He didn't speak. Marge's demeanor shifted instantly. She straightened, plastering a forced smile onto her face. "Another coffee, Mr. Davis?" The man lingered a moment longer before nodding. "That would be nice." Ethan could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Marge gave him a quick warning glance before stepping away. Ethan took the hint. He finished his coffee, dropped some cash on the counter, and left. As he stepped outside, the sun was already starting to dip. The town seemed to breathe with it, the air growing heavier, quieter. He walked briskly toward his car, mind racing. He had to get out of here. But as he reached for the door handle, he froze. Every tire on his car was slashed, and in the dust on his windshield, someone had written 2 words with a single, deliberate stroke of a finger. "Stay tonight." Ethan's breath came in short, ragged bursts. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the words etched into the dust on his windshield. "Stay tonight." Someone had done this deliberately. Someone wanted him here. He spun around, scanning the street. The town was still eerily quiet. No cars, no movement. Just the faint whistle of the wind slipping through the alleyways. Marge's warning echoed in his mind. "You should leave before nightfall." But that option was gone now. His tires were slashed, and the nearest gas station was at least 15 miles away, too far to walk before dark. His phone was useless without service. He was trapped, and then he saw them. A few figures scattered along the street. They stood motionless in the dimming light. Men, women, even a child, watching him. Just standing there. No expressions, no movement. His pulse hammered. He forced himself to act normal, yanking open the car door and pretending to rummage through his bag. A desperate attempt to look like he still had control of the situation. Out of the corner of his eye, one of the figures moved. A woman, stepping onto the sidewalk with an unnatural stiffness, like a puppet being guided by invisible strings. That was enough. Ethan grabbed his camera and bag, slammed the car door shut, and hurried down the street, back toward the Silver Creek Inn. The moment he reached the front steps, the town seemed to exhale. The figures didn't follow. They simply stood there, fading into the growing darkness. But he knew they were still watching. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. The man at the front desk barely looked up as Ethan entered. "I need another night," Ethan said, forcing calm into his voice. The man slid the same tarnished brass key across the counter without a word. Ethan grabbed it and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The hallway was dim, the light from the old bulbs flickering slightly. His room was exactly as he'd left it. Bed unmade, camera resting on the nightstand. He locked the door behind him and checked the window. The street below was empty now, but he knew that didn't mean he was alone. The words on his windshield burned in his mind. Stay tonight. Had it been a warning or a command? He pulled his camera from the bag, flipping through the photos from earlier. Most were of empty streets, old buildings, the faded charm of a forgotten town. Then he paused. A shot of the general store. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the woman in the upstairs window. But now that he looked closer, he realized something was wrong. Her face was blurred, not from movement, but as if something had smeared the image itself. And where her eyes should have been, there was nothing. Just dark, hollow voids. A chill ran through him. A knock sounded at the door. Software 3 slow raps. Ethan's stomach clenched. He stayed completely still, barely breathing. Another 3 knocks. He edged toward the door, heart hammering. Who is it? Silence. Then, the doorknob turned. The lock held, but the sound sent a bolt of panic through him. He grabbed the baseball bat he had seen in the hall closet earlier that day, gripping it tightly. The knob twisted again. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Ethan stood frozen, every muscle in his body locked in place. He waited a full minute before daring to move. Slowly, he crept toward the door and pressed his ear against it. Nothing. Carefully, he turned the lock and cracked the door open just enough to peek into the hallway. Empty. No one was there. But just before he closed the door again, something caught his eye. A single piece of paper had been slid under the door. He knelt, hesitating before picking it up. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and on it, written in shaky, uneven handwriting, were 4 words. Don't look at her. Ethan's throat went dry. He looked up, glancing down the hallway, and that's when he saw it. At the far end of the hall, near the old grandfather clock, a figure stood perfectly still. A woman. long black hair, head tilted slightly to the side. Watching him, Ethan's entire body went cold. He slammed the door shut, locked it, and stumbled back until he hit the edge of the bed. His breath came fast and shallow, his hands gripping the crumpled note. "Don't look at her," but he already had. And now, he knew. She wasn't just in the window. She was inside. Ethan sat frozen on the edge of the bed, gripping the crumpled note in his hands. His breathing was shallow, his pulse a deafening drum in his ears. The walls of the room felt closer, the air heavier, thick with something unseen, something waiting. He fought the urge to turn around, to look into the dark corners of the room where shadows stretched unnaturally long. The flickering light of the single lamp beside his bed did little to dispel the oppressive gloom. The silence pressed in. He glanced at the note again. "Don't look at her." The words seemed to vibrate on the page, an unspoken warning that settled deep into his bones. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The whispers, the figures in the street, the woman in the window. His camera lay beside him, its strap twisted, its lens still smeared with the residue of something not meant to be seen. A sound. Software slow. Three measured beats against the door. Ethan's stomach clenched. He forced himself not to move, not to breathe. The doorknob rattled. The lock held, but something pressed against the door from the other side. He could hear it. The gentle weight of fingers tracing the wood. The hesitant drag of nails. Then, the whisper. "I see you." It came from inside the room. Ethan spun, his breath catching in his throat. The room was empty, but the mirror above the dresser wasn't. His reflection stood there, wide-eyed, frozen in terror. And behind him, in the glass, was the woman. She loomed in the background, her head tilted too far, her blurred face shifting, distorting, as if trying to form something recognizable, but failing. Ethan jerked away from the mirror, his chest tightening. The whisper came again, this time closer, curling around him like cold breath on the back of his neck. "I see you." Then the lights flickered. A shadow stretched along the floor. Not his. He lunged for the door, yanking it open. The hallway was dark, the old grandfather clock at the end silent. He turned back. The mirror was empty. Ethan's hands trembled as he backed away from the door, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe he was dreaming. Maybe exhaustion had finally caught up with him. But his body knew the truth before his mind could fully accept it. Something was here. He moved cautiously to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to peek outside. The street below was eerily still. No cars, no people, no signs of life beyond the dim glow of a single street lamp. And yet, in the reflection of the glass, he saw movement. A dark figure standing in the middle of the road, looking up at him. His breath hitched. The figure didn't move. It didn't shift or waver. It was just there, watching. His hands tightened around the curtain. His instinct screamed at him to close it, to shut out whatever it was, but he couldn't look away. The figure's head tilted slightly, just like the woman in the mirror. His stomach dropped. Then, as if sensing his realization, the figure stepped forward. Ethan stumbled backward, the curtain slipping from his fingers. The room felt even smaller now, the walls pressing in, suffocating. He needed to leave. Now he grabbed his camera and bag, his movements frantic and clumsy. He had to get out of here before... A sudden, violent bang shook the door. Ethan jumped, his heart slamming against his ribs. Another bang, louder this time. The wood groaned under the pressure. Something was trying to get in. He backed away toward the bathroom, gripping his camera like a weapon. A ridiculous defense, but it was all he had. His eyes darted around the room, searching for another exit, another way out. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. Ethan ran. Down the hallway, past peeling wallpaper and dim sconces that barely illuminated the path ahead. The old building groaned as if shifting in its sleep. His feet pounded against the wooden floor, but the sound felt muffled, swallowed by the oppressive silence that filled the space around him. Something was behind him. He didn't dare turn to look. The whisper trailed him like a second shadow. "I see you." The lobby appeared ahead, its front doors standing like a portal to another world. Safety. Escape. His fingers closed around the brass handle. Locked. Panic surged through him. He yanked, twisted, slammed his shoulder against the wood, but the door refused to budge. The walls of the inn seemed to breathe, shifting inward, pressing against him. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, approaching from behind. A breath on his neck. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. "Don't look." Something brushed his shoulder, cold and raw. The scent of damp earth and decay filled his nostrils. He clenched his fists, willing himself to move, to run. A hand grabbed his wrist. He screamed, but another hand clamped over his mouth. His vision blurred as he was pulled backward, down a narrow corridor, away from the entrance. A door slammed. Darkness swallowed him whole. Part 6. The Hollow Ones. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was sitting on the floor of a small room. The walls were wooden, warped by age and moisture. A single oil lamp flickered in the corner, casting long, trembling shadows. His breath came fast and uneven. He wasn't alone. Marge stood against the opposite wall, watching him with wide, frantic eyes. "You looked at her, didn't you?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Marge exhaled sharply, her hands trembling. "She's inside now. Once she sees you, she doesn't forget." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What is she?" Marge hesitated, glancing at the door as if expecting it to burst open. "She's not a ghost," she finally said. "She's worse." Ethan's mind reeled. The townspeople. The unnatural silence. The figures standing, watching. A horrifying realization settled over him. "They're like her, aren't they?" Marge nodded. "They were like you once." A chill ran down his spine. He thought of the empty streets, the hollow stairs, the unnatural stillness. They weren't just trapped here. They had become part of it. The whispers slithered through the cracks in the walls, curling around the room like unseen fingers reaching for them. The air felt thick, suffocating. Ethan clutched his camera against his chest, his breath ragged. The flame of the oil lamp flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the warped wooden panels. He could feel it now, the weight of her presence pressing in, just beyond the door. Marge reached for his arm. "We have to move," she hissed. "She won't wait forever." Ethan swallowed, nodding. He forced his legs to work, to push past the fear rooting him in place. They slipped out of the small room, into the labyrinthine corridors of the inn. The walls stretched and twisted, like the very building was shifting, resisting their escape. A creak echoed from behind them. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. She was following. Ethan's heart pounded as he stumbled forward. Marge pulled him by the wrist, leading him through the dim hallways. The wooden planks groaned under their hurried steps. Doors loomed on either side, some ajar, revealing dark, empty spaces beyond. Others were sealed shut, as if whatever lay within had been trapped there long ago. The whispers grew louder. "I see you." Marge yanked him into a side passage, a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. She lit a match, its feeble glow revealing steps caked in dust and age. "This way! Hurry!" Ethan hesitated. Something about this stairwell felt wrong, but a sharp movement at the end of the hallway sent a bolt of terror through him. A shadow, tall and distorted, its head tilting unnaturally. The match flickered out, a breath at his ear. Ethan didn't think. He followed Marge down the stairs, into the waiting dark. Part 8, the road out. The basement was worse than he imagined. The air was damp, filled with the scent of mildew and something else, something rotten. Marge's small flame barely illuminated the room, revealing rows of ancient wooden shelves covered in dust and long-forgotten objects. Ethan shivered. "Are you sure this leads out?" Marge didn't answer right away. Her expression was grim. "It has to." They pushed forward, the ground uneven beneath their feet. The whispers above them grew fainter, but the weight of something unseen pressed against Ethan's chest. He could feel her, even down here. Then he saw them. Figures, lining the walls, standing unnaturally still. Their faces were blurred, just like hers. Eyes like empty voids, bodies draped in the tattered remnants of old clothing. Marge stopped cold. "The hollow ones," she whispered. Ethan's stomach twisted. The realization hit him like ice in his veins. These were the others, the ones who had stayed. Then, as if sensing his thoughts, the figures moved. A collective shift, heads turning, bodies swaying toward them in eerie unison. Their empty eyes locked onto Ethan. A deep, guttural whisper filled the space. "Stay." Panic took over. Marge grabbed his hand, pulling him through the rows of figures. Their movement was sluggish, unnatural, like puppets guided by unseen strings. But they were closing in. The door at the end of the basement loomed ahead, barely visible in the dim light. Their only chance. Ethan reached it first, fumbling for the handle. It wouldn't budge. "No, no, no!" The figures drew closer. Marge shoved past him, twisting something at the base of the door. A latch. Rusted. Stiff. A hand brushed Ethan's shoulder. The door burst open. They tumbled out into the cold night, gasping for breath. The inn loomed behind them, its windows dark, silent. The street stretched ahead, eerily still. Marge didn't stop. "We keep running. We don't look back." Ethan wanted to ask where they were going, but his instincts screamed at him to listen. They ran, feet pounding against the pavement, lungs burning. The further they got from the inn, the lighter the air felt, the stronger his body moved. The road appeared ahead, the Welcome to Silver Creek sign barely visible in the fog. Then Ethan made the mistake of glancing back. She was there, standing at the inn's doorway, still, watching, smiling. He stumbled, his body seizing with cold. Marge pulled him forward. "Don't stop." Ethan forced himself onward. The road was just ahead, just a few more steps. Then the town shifted. The street warped. The buildings stretched, elongating into grotesque, impossible angles. The ground trembled beneath them. A sound, deep, bone-chilling, echoed through the night. A final, desperate whisper. "You belong to me." Ethan lunged forward, crossing the invisible threshold of the town. And then, everything went still. The weight vanished. The air lightened. The oppressive silence was gone. They were outside Silver Creek. Ethan collapsed onto the pavement, his chest heaving. The town lay behind them, just a quiet, sleepy place under the moonlight, as if nothing had ever happened. Marge stood beside him, staring at the town. "We made it." Ethan turned to her, ready to speak. But then he noticed something. The way her shadow stretched slightly too far. The faint blur at the edges of her face. His stomach clenched. Marge smiled at him, but it was wrong. Too still. Too knowing. And then, softly, she whispered, "I see you." Ethan collapsed onto the pavement, his chest heaving. The town lay behind them, just a quiet, sleepy place under the moonlight, as if nothing had ever happened. Marge stood beside him, staring at the town. "We made it." Ethan turned to her, ready to speak. But then he noticed something. The way her shadow stretched slightly too far. The faint blur at the edges of her face. His stomach clenched. Marge smiled at him, but it was wrong. Too still. Too knowing. And then softly, she whispered, "I see you." Ethan's breath caught. His body screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, locked in place by the weight of her words. The whisper was the same voice, the same chilling cadence as the one that had haunted him inside the town. Marge stepped forward. The pavement under her feet seemed to ripple, distorting like a reflection on water. Her eyes, once warm and human, darkened into bottomless voids. "No," Ethan breathed, stepping back. Marge tilted her head, the eerie smile never faltering. "You thought it would be that easy?" Ethan turned and ran. The night air was sharp in his lungs as he sprinted down the desolate road. The trees flanked him on both sides, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. He didn't dare look back. Then the road shifted beneath him. The asphalt cracked like brittle glass, and the world lurched. Ethan stumbled, hitting the ground hard. The wind knocked from his lungs. He gasped, rolling onto his back, and saw what had happened. The road he had just run across was gone. In its place stretched the town of Silver Creek, its streets impossibly warped, its buildings twisting into unnatural angles. The inn's windows flickered with ghostly light. The sign that had once read, "Welcome to Silver Creek," now bore only one word: "Stay." A slow, deliberate footstep crunched against the pavement behind him. Ethan turned his head just enough to see Marge, or whatever was left of her, standing over him. Her form flickered, distorting in and out of focus like a signal barely coming through. She reached down with elongated fingers, her voice a guttural murmur. "You never really left." A chilling wind swept through the air, bringing with it an acrid, decayed scent. The buildings groaned as if they were breathing. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, reaching for Ethan like clawed fingers. A deep hum vibrated through the very bones of the town, as if something beneath the earth was stirring awake. Ethan scrambled backward, but the pavement warped beneath him, gripping his legs like wet sand. He clawed at the ground, his fingers scraping against the cold stone, but it was useless. Marge stepped closer, her body flickering like a dying candle. Her voice dropped to a whisper, thick with something ancient and hungry. "She knows you now," Ethan screamed. His vision swam as the town shifted and coiled around him. The very air felt alive, pressing in on him from all sides, suffocating him with whispers that bled into his mind. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but the weight of the unseen hands kept him frozen. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw it. A figure standing at the town's entrance. The woman from the window. Her face was still blurred, an absence rather than a presence. But she raised one hand, beckoning him forward. Ethan hesitated. Every fiber of his being screamed at him not to trust her, not to take another step. But the road was no longer an option. There was nowhere left to go. Slowly, he stepped toward her. The whispers grew louder, slithering through his ears, burrowing into his skull. He could hear voices now, dozens of them, crying out, pleading, warning. The woman's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and for the first time, she spoke. "Choose." The town trembled. Behind him, Marge's form unraveled, her smile stretching into something too wide, too grotesque. The buildings of Silver Creek shimmered, waiting. Ethan swallowed hard. Choose what? The woman raised her hand, palm up. In it lay a small, rusted key, the key to Silver Creek. A deep knowing settled into Ethan's bones. If he took the key, he would never leave. He would become part of the town, another lost soul bound to its curse. But if he refused, his gaze flicked back to the road, the endless loop, the ever-watching town. The cycle would never end. He would run forever. His fingers trembled as he reached forward. The key was ice against his skin. The woman nodded once. "Welcome home." The world shattered. Darkness swallowed him whole. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was standing in the center of Silver Creek. The town was quiet. The sky was a deep, endless gray. The streets were empty, waiting. And Ethan understood. The whispers had stopped, but he could still feel them. Watching, waiting beneath the surface. The inn loomed ahead, its windows dark. He knew what lay beyond them now. He knew who was waiting. Ethan turned, looking at the inn, at the windows where figures now stood, watching. His breath steadied. His pulse slowed. He was home. From the shadows, a new voice whispered, "I see you." And this time, Ethan whispered back, "I see you too." If this world of mystery has captivated you, be sure to like and comment with the tales you'd love to hear next. Don't forget to subscribe and join me again in the quiet of the night for more journeys into the unknown.